before we went on the air, and you can't really blame the Bigfoot. It's sort of like when the white men came in here and ramrodded through the Native American territories. And that's what's really happened to the Bigfoot. I don't hear stories about them hurting people, but they sure do try, in many cases, to scare people away. And they'll throw rocks, but they won't hit you. They'll, make these sounds that send chills all the way up and down your spine. But they don't. They're not really violent for the most part that I've heard of.
Well, can I play a sound real quick of a Bigfoot I have?
Okay.
Okay, let me key it up here, and let's see, go. So that's the little sound I found on the internet of a Bigfoot. It kind of the sound I heard was similar to that, but it was more of a threat type of sound than that. That sounded more like a calling.
We've got one story on there that we posted earlier this year, so it's not going to be in the archives. It's just in the Bigfoot section. And the title of it is Archaic Japanese and Bigfoot Language. And what's really neat is this man, let's see if I can get his name straight. I think it's Scott Nelson. And his professional career was in deciphering different languages and stuff for the Navy. He did that for, I think, like 30 years. And he knows many languages. And he got a hold of one of the recordings that was done by Ron Moorhead, who has done a lot of recording of Bigfoot sounds. And this is, I've heard of several of them, but this one's just incredible. And I would encourage people to listen to it. It really sounds like a samurai. In fact, it's labeled samurai chatter. And again, if you just go to the Bigfoot section for this year, and the story is Archaic Japanese and Bigfoot Language. When you read the story that goes with it and then listen to it, it gives you a pretty complete picture. There is language. Scott Nelson had to slow down the tapes in order to begin to hear the language. And there are, things that are actually in English also. Phrases like, I can't quote it off, but it's like this one Bigfoot was mostly interested in food, and it was like, want plenty food. In other words, they'd heard, people speaking languages, and they picked up on some of it.
Well, I wouldn't doubt it. I mean, you take animals like dogs and stuff; they understand. That doesn't take them very long to understand certain commands and certain words.
Especially if especially when it's involved with food, right?
Oh yeah, but one thing, Mary, about Bigfoot, I don't know if they are as friendly as some people say they are towards humans. I mean, they only want to scare you away. I mean, the Indians talked about them actually, taking their tribe members, their women and kids, and basically eating them. I've talked to a couple, tribe members, and some of their stories, that's what they, believe. But then on the other hand, in the National Forest System, since the 1900s to about 5 years ago, there was like 14,000 people. It vanished. Now, some of them in the park system.
People are blaming that. I think it's Paulides, if that's the way you pronounce his last name. And I think he's one of the ones that's blaming it on the Bigfoot. I did some interviews with a man who has a cosmic top security clearance. And he said that the disappearance of people, especially children, small children, is actually being done by a quite evil race of ETs.
That's a possibility because, I mean...
he says that's the reason for it, and that the Bigfoot are being falsely accused of that.
Well, they could, be blaming them for that reason and not to alarm the people. But, 14,000 people is a lot. And, and in some of the cases, like children, like there's one I was reading about where the kid was like maybe 30 feet from, the parents. And the parents just, were busy putting their tent up, turned their head. This 5-year-old totally disappeared. Well, they found him a few days later, or what was left of him, okay, up on a side of a mountain 15 miles away. To get to that mountain 15 miles away, which a 5-year-old is not going to be able to do,
Right.
he would have had to cross some major, major rivers that
Well,
even a human wouldn't be able to cross.
This man with the high security clearance, he said that some of them refer to this race as the dominators, and that certain aspects of our government, which are kind of which are on the dark side, so to speak, will exchange technology with this race of ETs in exchange for
Food,
human beings to eat.
Yeah, I would.
And they prefer young children.
I wouldn't.
I guess they taste better. I know that sounds so gory, and I certainly wasn't, thinking about talking about this tonight. But like I said, the guy has incredible credentials, and I have to consider that might be the case. And even though I've heard about Bigfoot, scaring people off with rocks and things like that, most of the stories I hear are either they're just simply trying to avoid us. I also have there was a man who was retired military. Well, he had to retire early, so he wasn't an old man. He had a health problem. And he got a small cabin in the mountains not too far from where I live. And I won't go into his whole story, but he eventually, at first heard these sounds of splashing in the creek near his house. Eventually, he found out there was a pair of Bigfoot and their two, let's say, teenage children that lived up the mountain behind him, a totally undeveloped area. And he eventually made friends with the male. When the man would go out and work in his garden, the male would eventually come down when he was working in the garden, and he would share food from the garden with him. And that I would consider that very, very peaceful. So we have to keep this stuff balanced. Another story that gives a total different perspective is a story that comes from Joan Ocean. Now, she is the most recognized dolphin expert in the world. She lives in Hawaii. And she was contacted by somebody here in the continental United States who had Bigfoot on their land, and she was contacting Joan to get some hints on how to communicate with the Bigfoot. Eventually, Joan came from Hawaii to the mountains, and she was able to make contact with a very evolved group of, or clan of ETs, and they were able to communicate at a pretty good high level. One female Sasquatch is what they were calling him, was like a medicine woman or like a healer, and had great knowledge, and could even they could even print in English and also in ancient Irish. I'm going to say it wrong. Agam. It's the old Irish way of writing where they have a horizontal line, and then they'll make lines vertically both above and below the line, and they represent letters. And it's the same Bigfoot were able to use that language also. So that was a very evolved group of Bigfoot.
Bigfoot,
so
yeah.
they are not all the same. And down in Florida, they call them skunk apes. They seem to be smaller, and they don't seem to be as intellectual and curious as some of the ones in the western mountains.
How about being aggressive? I mean, you talk about the Yeti and the Himalayas and stuff like that. It's supposed to be really aggressive, but maybe their aggressive, being aggressive, I should say, is because of what we've done to them. Back 150 years ago, 200 years ago, as we were settling this country, the same thing as we did to the buffalo and stuff. We made them almost virtually extinct.
Right.
Maybe they're totally fearful of man.
And their space is being infringed upon more and more and more. And so where can they go? It's like they're down to their last acre, and they have all the more reason to want to protect it.
Well, you know, a lot of people don't realize where I even moved 20 years ago. You know, I moved in a rural area, which there was virtually no houses. And my property has almost 2 acres of cedar trees, but everything down my road 20 years ago was all forest. You know, then gradually, every couple of years, somebody bought property. The first thing they did is logged it out. Now, probably in this area, I'm one of the few people that have a lot of cedar trees left. Like you walk out my yard and go past the horses, you're in a little mini forest. Well, you know, when I first moved here, I had deer. I actually saw a bear and a cub, you know, walking down the street. You know, the only thing I see now, very seldom do I see a deer anymore. And, you know, I do see raccoons and possums, and that's about it. I mean,
which really don't count for much when you think about other animals.
No, but what I'm saying is, as mankind keeps spreading out, the animals or the wildlife, they have to go farther out, but then they get trapped. Where do they go?
And I think that's where they begin to be more defensive. And then we have idiots that go out there and they just want to trophy hunt. The Bigfoot, I think, have the advantage of being telepathic. I think they can sense what people are about. I think they can sense trouble coming long before we know that they know. And I think they do a pretty good job of avoiding these guys that have a gun over their shoulder and want to shoot them.
Well, I had a guest on my show here a couple months ago, maybe about 4 months ago. That's what his idea was this summer. You know, he lives up near Mount Rainier up in Washington. His idea, him and a bunch of buddies were going to go, you know, on a trip for about a month out in the woods and find a Bigfoot and shoot it and bring it in to, you know, show people. You know, and I said, well, before you do that, you know, you could be charged with murder. I mean, depending on the DNA. You know, from the other standpoint, I mean, you know, why would you want to do that? Why would you want to go kill something?
And there are some people who have aimed a gun at a Bigfoot and made contact with the face of the Bigfoot and saw such humanness in the face that they couldn't shoot.
Yeah, I know. I remember the face real well. I mean, looking through a telephoto, and it does resemble not some. You know, a lot of people say they look like an ape. I would say they look more human than ape, but they I don't know. I only looked at the face for a split second before I took off running.
Well, you know, as much as I'm interested in the whole subject, I think if one suddenly popped its face at my window right here, I probably would, you know, be freaked out, even though I, you know, have learned quite a bit about the Bigfoot. I think it still would scare most people.
Well, you know, after me and my friend, who was a medical doctor, we ran into that one up in the Canadian Rockies. You know, we had to drive about maybe 10, 15 miles, and we came across a little store. And we were really shook up, and the owner of the store knew that we were shook up. And I said, well, we saw this thing. It was about like 8 to 10 feet tall. And he goes, no, you're saying it's a bear? And I go, it didn't look like a bear. And he goes, well, we've had a lot of sightings up here of Bigfoot. But he says, you know, if you're out there with only a camera and no weapons, you're crazy. And I go, why? Because he said, between the bears and they feel the Bigfoot, they have found partially eaten humans out there. It went out hunting or went out in the woods and, you know, and all of a sudden we're attacked by either a bear or a Bigfoot or something, and we're partially eaten. So, I mean, you know, that was...
I haven't gotten any stories like that around here. None at all. We see the footprints. We see evidence of them trying to, you know, avoid us. The closest thing we had to anything that might be considered violent, and if people want to read this story, just type in Valley of the Bigfoot in our search bar, and they can find it. This goes back a couple of years. And there's this place up in the mountains where, you know, to get there, you go down a one-lane gravel little road that goes along the side of a creek, and when you get to the end of it, it opens up into like a bowl-shaped little valley. And there's 3 houses, 2 houses and a barn and a pond. And one man was out there with a jackhammer trying to do something to the pond. And all of a sudden, the jack went right into something hollow, and the water started pouring